ideas, their feelings, and their expression. And blacks sit there all day long and look at TV and they hear those words and they use them and in their head, but it doesn't make that much sense, but they'll follow it. And see, until we learn that 5-story building and say, no, the 5-story building says communication is on the 4th floor. The 1st floor, what you got to be focused on is building these businesses. And what kind of businesses are you going to build? And Dr. Anderson is saying this, and I'm the only one saying this, and I'll back it up. You build your businesses around your cultural values. And you must always dominate in businesses wherever your culture tells you that that's something that you're dominating in population or spending patterns. And you try to say, I'm gonna take that over from the bottom to the top. In seafoods, we're gonna control everything from the boat to the throat. You know, and then this we're gonna and meat we're gonna buy it the best from the root to the tooth. But you got to stay in your own culture and say, I'm gonna control my own culture and the values therein and build my business on those cultures until we got total control of it, just like Jews have control of their economies in their neighborhoods. Hispanic have controls of their neighborhoods. Everybody got controls of the business in the neighborhood but us. Our neighborhood is totally wide open, controlling nothing. And even the few politicians we got, they're not controlled by us. They're controlled by immigrants that come into our neighborhoods and become successful off of our money. And they take that money that we put in their pockets and in their cash register, and they go buy our politicians. So that a black politician would do more for an immigrant than it would do for black folk, because the black folk are not bringing them the capital. It's the immigrants that got stores in black neighborhoods that's taking that money and bringing it to them. And so therefore, what are our cultural values? So today, that's what I was going to talk about. We're going to talk about identifying those cultural values and start building businesses around them and industries around them and monopolizing them. Don't let other people take your culture and make money off of it. That's what I'm coming to. And the school should be teaching that. The school teachers should say, hey, I can't teach you anything until I check with the 1st floor and find out what they're going to do. 1st floor makes the decision. They say, well, Dr. Anderson, this is 2020, and in 2040, we're all going to the moon. And if black folk are to survive on the moon, what should be the role of the schools? And go up to the 5th floor and tell those schools teachers that. And you go up to the 5th floor, you say, well, the 1st floor going to start pretty well convinced we're going to be on the moon in another 20 years and to try to live on the moon. So what should we be teaching our kids? Then the teacher say, okay, shut down all the curriculums that we were using now. And now, what are we going to do on the moon? First, we need to start putting more emphasis on biology and on chemistry. And we should be teaching more kids about becoming astronauts and learning how to fly and out of space. We need to be creating equipment that they can wear in space, and some of the uniforms and clothing and the oxygen regulators and all these kind of things. We need to be preparing our kids in that world, and we need to start putting them in the classes in the high school that teaches them more about outer space and all this kind of stuff. But it's the 1st floor that should be dictating our culture. And you say, well, what is our culture now, Dr. Anderson? One of them is sports. It came directly out of slavery. We've always been very strong in sports because of our genetics, our body build. But now, and that means we should be dominating and controlling any sport: football, baseball, tennis, golf, basketball, skating, ice skating, sledding, anything. We should be dominating, but not only dominating, some of us are dominating, we should be controlling it. That should be one of our major industries. We should be producing all equipment. I don't care whether it's bobsleds or skis or clothing, to uniforms, to pillowcases, for houses and sheets and anything. Going into the commerce, everything should be coming out of the black community pertaining to sports.
Well, Dr. I'm curious about this. So, when you talk about sports, I was thinking about recently how Major League Baseball decided to recognize the Negro leagues I don't know if you saw that in the media, but they decided to recognize the Negro leagues and finally acknowledge that they were professional leagues. I don't think we talked about this too much. I know I talked about it, but I can't remember if you and I talked about it. I'd like to get your take on that. I personally was a little bit offended because I felt that the incorporation of Jackie Robinson into Major League Baseball was a huge downfall for the Negro leagues. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I read that the year after Jackie Robinson left was when the Negro League started to decline. And I have my perspective on it, and I think they've heard that. I'd like for them to hear your perspective as somebody who really knows the Negro Leagues very well as a history expert.
Well, I appreciate that. And way before we got the Negro League, there were a few blacks playing with a few white teams back in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, and they had a few here and there, and with very little attention, but they were playing, and as tokens. And but finally, increasingly, black folks say, forget it, because right now that should be our culture. It's our culture. Just because we got a black, this is way before Jackie Robinson. This maybe be 70 years before Jackie Robinson. And they said, we got blacks that excel in baseball at stealing the bases, running the bases, and catching and being catchers out there. We got blacks that are good in boxing. We had some people way before Jack Johnson in the bare knuckle days in boxing. They was knocking white boys out on a regular basis. but we were not trying to dominate. But increasingly, as we move further and further towards the 1900s, black folk did start dominating. And like one of the biggest areas they were dominating at that time, by the time we got pretty close to the 1900s, was racetracks, was horse racing. And all the major jockeys, guess what, were blacks. They set a record they've never been broken. They set records in horse racing that is still standing. Wow. And across the board. And yet, but they held those positions all the way up from, let's say, into the 1900s. They held those positions until about 1909, 1910, around that when the Urban League and NWCP came into existence. But they dominated those things. Everybody wanted to bet their money on a horse that was being ridden by a black jockey.
Really?
Yeah, and then all of a sudden they started to say, well, now that we're going to socially integrate to some of this stuff, now we're moving to some new stuff called universality. They started picking up Hispanics. They said, well, Hispanic was, well, why don't we just drop the blacks, period, and just go pick up some Hispanics. They're not as heavy as black. We can get a lighter weight person, a smaller person, and put him on a horse, and we won't need blacks anymore. So after about 1910, blacks were gone. They lost that whole industry. But blacks dominated that industry. They were the trainers. They were the caretakers. As a matter of fact, the word like cowboy, cow came up because blacks were the ones that took care of all the cows in the fields. That's why that was the word was from in the culture. It meant young black boys. And that's why they call them cowboys. And same thing with attendants, in families, for keeping the house like that, and servants and stuff, house boys. All those things that had a boy attached to it was talking about blacks at that point. That was our culture. And that's why you had that movie not too long ago about Driving Miss Daisy, that kind of thing, where you had everybody, blacks were the drivers in later in automobiles, but initially in wagons and carriages and stuff. So what I'm saying is that those were our industries. Those were jobs opportunities. We had those things locked and boxed. So we always could find jobs in those. As a matter of fact, even on the railroads, all the porters were blacks. That's why you had the Pullman strikes back in the 1920s when blacks started boycotting and started their own unions. That's why blacks started building unions in the 1920s to say, we're going to hold on to some of these things in our culture. We're the porters. We're the baggage handlers. And even though that was negative, now it wasn't negative then. Those are big jobs the black school could get. That was our culture.
So can I ask you, Dr. Anderson, how do you lose an industry? Meaning, when you look at the Negro leagues, for example, you own the whole league. You got the businesses connected to the league. You got all this commerce happening around the league. was it mostly just integration? Like, was integration pretty much the killer? And you mentioned Urban League and NWCP. Did you bring them up because you felt that they were catalysts to the destruction of Black wealth?
Yeah, they did, and probably more accidentally. I don't think most of the Blacks were purposely trying to do it, but what they got hung up on was it was a new mindset. As they moved progressively into the Depression years, they started acquiring a new mindset because the Depression, just like this pandemic now, wiped out a lot of businesses. The Depression in the 1920s wiped out a lot of Black businesses. And so Blacks then started, and between about, let's say about 1929 or 28, all the way up to almost 1938, for that 10-year period, Blacks got wiped out, period. Because see, from the 1920s to 1920, Black folks probably had about 100,000, maybe about 20 times more Black businesses per 100,000 Black people than we got today, which means we've gone back from where we were in 1920. Because Blacks had businesses in 1920, Blacks had no education. Let me go back to those grandparents again. Blacks had very little education, but they had common sense. And nowadays, I found out that even that's not too common anymore. But in those days, we had common sense. And they said, if white folks want to own property, there must be a value in owning property and controlling property. And so consequently, in the 1920 census, we had about 20, we had almost like about 20 some Black movie producing studios. Did you know that? We had about 20 some movie studios where we were producing our own movies, own Black movies, and promoting our own culture through our own Black movies. And that was in by 1920. But by the 1940s, those businesses were dying out because of social immigration. So Black folks would say what they wanted because of the NAACP, not the NAACP was some of them, because that was in the civil rights movement, but also like Black preachers and Black newspaper editors. They wanted to get away from Blackness.
Oh, really?
And in response to World War I, when Blacks started coming back from World War I, you had Blacks that undergone a mindset going to Europe and fighting for Black, and they had the Hellcats out of New York. Those Blacks were very strong fighters against the Germans in World War I. They were one of the most decorated groups out of the military for bravery, and I put maybe one or two of those in the last book, The Black History Reader. But they were fighting like hell, and some of them call them Hellcats and stuff like this. But they were very dominating. And later on, we heard about, maybe 30 years later, we heard about the Tuskegee Airmen. But we had the Hellcats on the ground back and doing some of the same stuff back